You can't tell the public, sorry, the reason you lost your home because of the flood was because we didn't have enough resources. Nobody wants to hear that. That's not an excuse. So you need to do everything you can with the resources you've got. And that's why collaboration and engaging partners in this space is so critical.
In a world filled with chaos and a myriad of risks, there is opportunity. You're listening to Riding the Wave, Project Management for Emergency Managers, where we discuss how we adapt and rise above those rolling waves of hazards and threats we face, and rise to the top. And now, your host, the president of Pinnacle Performance Management, Andrew Boyarsky.
Andrew Phelps is the Chief Operating Officer with AC Disaster Consulting and has more than 2 decades in emergency management and operational leadership. He served previously as the director of the Oregon Department of Emergency Management. He is also the author of a master's thesis called Play Well with Others, Improvisational Theater and Collaboration in the Homeland Security Environment. It was published in the Naval Postgraduate School. Andrew, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me, Andrew. I'm excited.
So I want to start off with some of the basics on improv theater. And again, for those who will delve into more of your background on the longer bio, you have a theater background, which I think is unique and brings a lot of great things. What are some of the basic challenges in engaging emergency management and public safety stakeholders?
Yeah, when you look at stakeholders or partners in that enterprise of emergency management and public safety, you've got certainly that public engagement piece, right? And then there's the law enforcement, elected officials, fire department, those public health, the more critical day-to-day folks that you engage with to sort of get the job done and do the mission. You know, the go-to challenge for anyone working in emergency management is almost always resources, right? You've got cities and counties and states that I've never talked to an emergency manager at any of those levels who has what they need, who has everything that they need. And they're like, nope, we're all set. You can turn off the funding hose. There's always a need. There's always more that needs to get done, because as emergency managers, we're problem solvers, and all we see sometimes around us are problems. And gosh, if I just had this one more person who could focus on that for 6 months, boy, that would be great. And you get that one person, it's like, okay, well, now this problem comes up and I wish I had a resource to deal with that. So there's resources, but as an emergency manager who's been chronically under-resourced in my public sector career, you that doesn't carry any water. You can't tell the public, sorry, the reason you lost your home because of the flood was because we didn't have enough resources. Nobody wants to hear that. That's not an excuse. So you need to do everything you can with the resources you've got. And that's why collaboration and engaging partners in this space is so critical. And when we have barriers to that collaboration and to engaging our partners, oftentimes I find it comes down to a lack of clarity of roles or expectations. There's oftentimes issues of mistrust. There's a lack of capabilities of what your partners can do, what they bring to the table. They don't know what you bring to the table. That's something that I think probably most emergency managers have gone through at some point, where they step into an emergency management director role or a planner or emergency management coordinator, and they spend an inordinate amount of time educating the city manager or the mayor, or the county commissioner, or the governor's office what emergency management can do for that jurisdiction. Inflexibility becomes an issue. We can sometimes be too rigid in the public safety environment. Territorialism can be an impediment to effectively collaborating and working together. And all of those things also can support a lack of accountability. We understand that we're in resource constrained environments. We have an inbox that keeps getting bigger, and our outbox or completed list seems to never catch up. And it makes holding ourselves and holding those partners that we have expectations of accountable that much more challenging.
So given that thorny problem there, right, and those challenges, what are some of the basics of improv theater that can help with engaging those stakeholders and, let's say, addressing some of those challenges?
Yeah, got into emergency management and disaster response and recovery and emergency services and all that stuff. I was an actor in New York And I say that I was much more of an auditioner, I guess, than an actor probably. But I spent a lot of my time doing improvisational theater and looking at ways to perform that were a little bit differently than just traditional scripted work. And so having that background and trying to bring that background to the work we do in emergency management, I had a light bulb moment where I recognized that emergency management is predicated on collaboration, and improvisation is is predicated on collaboration. And so how do we take those sort of principles? Because in improv, there's not really rules, right? It's guidelines, and it's meant to be flexible and dynamic and everything else, and not overly rigid. And that sort of, in some ways, describes emergency management. Emergency management shouldn't be too black and white or overly prescriptive. It needs to be able to be as dynamic as the emergencies and the disasters we're preparing for and responding to. So distilling improvisation for the theater, and I think the same holds true for jazz improvisation and on the music side and some other things. I was able to distill it into a handful of principles, and I've studied with some really amazing people. Paul Sills was like the father of improv. He created the Second City in Chicago, and if you've ever watched Whose Line Is It Anyway, or Reno 911, or any of the great like improvised TV shows that are out there, and even like Spinal Tap and some of those cool movies that you see, Best in Show and all those movies. If you've seen any of that, it came out of him and his work in Chicago in the 50s and 60s. So to have been able to study with him just gave me a unique insight, I think, into what some of those principles are that allowed him to create what he created in the improv space. So the big one that everybody I think is familiar with, if you're familiar with anything about improv at all, it's the concept of yes and. Not saying no to things, saying yes, accepting those offers, and then building upon what you've been given. If you're doing an improv scene and someone's like, "Oh, this is delicious ice cream that we're eating," you're like, "We're not eating ice cream." Okay, well, that kind of kills the scene there. That was fun. But if it's like, "Oh, this is delicious ice cream we're eating," "Oh yes, I've never had mint chocolate chip sitting on a beach before, in the middle of a hurricane. This is wonderful." And then it totally like evolves the scene to where you are, and you start creating this idea of space, and the story just sort of keeps moving from there. But when you say no to things, you close yourself off from opportunity. And it can be hard as an emergency manager to keep saying yes to things. We sometimes say yes, but if we can find ways to get to yes more frequently, it allows us to be the problem solvers that our communities expect us to be. There's other pieces of it. Serving the good of the whole is one of the principles of improvisation that I've keyed in on. It's not about you. There's no star improv performer. It's the group. It's that group dynamic. And just like in emergency management and in the emergency service and response world, it's not about the police department. It's certainly not about the emergency manager, not about the fire department. It's about the community coming together, solving a problem to make people's bad days, to make a community's bad days a little bit better, something that we can move through and improve upon for next time. One of the ones that's a little bit, maybe, I don't know, controversial, but one that was always important to me was to make your fellow players look brilliant. In improv, you'll find yourself doing a scene or something, and my improv name, someone will call me in a scene Jim, and it's always Jim. "Hey Jim, how's it going, Jim? What's happening, Jim? Hey Jim, let's do this." And then someone else will come into the scene and they'll forget, and they'll be like, "Hey Joe." And I'm like, "Hey, yeah, it's me, Jimmy Joe." Some people call me Jim, some people call me Joe. And you're sort of taking care of what could have been a mistake. And you don't want to be like, "My name is not Joe, you idiot. I'm Jim." Because again, that just sucks the oxygen out of what you're trying to build. And it's not about glossing over mistakes in the emergency management side when you take that principle and apply it to emergency management. It's about giving your partners the things they need to be successful. Sharing that situation report as broadly as you possibly can, so everybody has the information they need to make the decision they need to make to be part of the solution. And you don't want to hang your partners up to dry, throw them under the bus. You want everybody that you're working with to feel like they have what they need to do what they need to do to be successful. Because when your partners are successful, you're successful, and we're all successful. Progressing the action is a big piece of improvisation. You don't want to get wrapped around the axle of the insignificant necessarily. I mean, there are times, I guess, where in an improv thing, if you focus on a small detail, it can be entertaining, but you don't want to just get mired in something that's insignificant. And that's so important with emergency management. I remember during our COVID response in the state of Oregon, like there was this obsession with how many masks do we have in the state today? I don't know, not enough. I'll tell you that right now. But that became like we were spending hours and hours and tons of resources trying to count the number of masks. And it's like, we know we need more. So why are we letting that suck all of our time and energy and resources and creating the stress that we don't need when it's not something that's going to help with our decision making? And I guess the final one that I would maybe share is this notion of allowing what is presented to change you. When you're doing an improv scene and somebody walks on with a new piece of information, you're at a baseball game in the improv scene, and it's such a great game. And somebody comes in, oh, hey, guys, glad to join you. Boy, I didn't know it was going to be raining today. You have to do something with that. You can't just ignore that. It's like, oh yeah, me neither. I wish I had my umbrella. Oh, I've got an extra umbrella. Here you go. It's up there. If you don't do something with that, then the audience is always wondering, well, hey, but it's raining, and I don't see that it's raining anymore. It kind of ruins the illusion you're trying to create. It's so applicable to the work we do, where you get these new inputs and injects all the time, new pieces of information, a new weather report, a new resource, a challenge with a resource. You've got to be able to take that information and allow that to inform your next decision point. And during disasters, you're constantly being inundated with inputs. And I've always felt that a wealth of information can create sort of a poverty of attention. And it can become really distracting sometimes, but you have to be able to focus on what is important, understand sort of how that little piece of information that you just got is going to fit into that broader puzzle and be able to do something with it. So sort of distilling improv into those, roughly 5 principles, they also serve as ways, if you kind of keep them in the back of your mind somewhere, ways to overcome some of those barriers. There's a territorialism issue happening. Well, it's like, okay, I understand that you think you own this piece of the puzzle and that this is your job and it's nobody else's job. I get it, but let's see what we can do to keep this action moving, to not get wrapped around the insignificance of what it is you think is your piece here, and we're going to keep moving towards those objectives that we've set. So when you've got an issue of territorialism and trying to keep the action moving, or if there's a competition for resource issue, keeping in mind that notion of serving the good of the whole makes a big difference, where it's like, okay, where is this resource going to be the most effective? And again, get us closer to sort of meeting those goals. In an improv scene, your goal is to maybe tell a compelling story or a funny narrative and get the audience to laugh and have a good time. In a disaster or emergency response, it might be to write a really comprehensive, great plan with support and buy-in from all the partners. It might be to evacuate a neighborhood in the next 60 minutes before there's an issue with the hazmat release. It's all about driving towards those objectives and getting everybody aligned on what those objectives are. In an improv scene, everyone's usually pretty clear on what the objectives are, something compelling and entertaining. And we need to have that same alignment in the emergency management enterprise.
I want to dwell upon a couple of things in terms of implementation. As the saying goes, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I've seen organizations where that's a positive aspect, where despite the challenging situation, that organizational culture rises to the occasion. And I've seen negative aspects where it's a new idea or new initiative and that organizational culture just rejects it. And I can imagine in some organizations, it might be a little challenging. What cultural shifts are needed within organizations to embrace improvisational, trust-based engagement?
Yeah. So you hear over and over again in emergency management, like, oh boy, we're really building the airplane as we're flying it. Mm-hmm. And there are times when that's unavoidable. Improvisation is not just about making stuff up. There's an objective there. There's a goal, and there's those principles that sort of guide what it is that you do. I mean, there's a reason, I guess, you have to maybe take a class or two before you start understanding what improv is all about and how to do it. So there are times, obviously, when building the airplane as we fly, to use that metaphor, is unavoidable. A novel disaster response, something that your community organization hasn't seen before. Mm-hmm. Wherever we can take those opportunities to reduce how often or how much of the airplane we're building as we're flying, that becomes really, really important, so that you're not constantly in the state of making stuff up. I feel like when we're building the airplane, when we're flying, a lot of times it is making stuff up, and you have to have the flexibility and the ability to do that. But you also have to have the discipline and the structure to do it in a way that's defensible. I've always said at every level of government that I've ever worked at, I will go in front of a legislative committee anytime and justify the decisions that I've made, but I never want to be put in a position where I have to justify not having made a decision. So to be able to build the plane while you fly and make decisions with limited information and in really time constrained circumstances with a whole lot of stress, it just has to be defensible. And you have to understand why you made the decision that you made, probably a level of documentation to that, and to build that partnership. One of the things, especially during COVID, that I saw, not just here in Oregon, but across the country, you would see press briefings sometimes, and it was like just the mayor, just the governor, just the public health person. And there was no concept of a broader team or a broader structure that was behind the decisions that were being made. You can look back now 6 years later, and it's like, well, there were some interesting decisions that were being made, and people were making the best decisions that they could. But was it just that one person that was making that decision, or was it that team, that enterprise that was making those decisions and working to implement them? Taking some of these principles and thinking of it sort of in terms of bringing these improvisers together to create something, that's going to solve a problem and is bigger than anything that any one of us could solve on our own. Having that network, having that group, having your peers standing at that press conference with you, sitting at that table in front of the cameras, goes a long way. You don't feel like you're out on an island. You don't feel isolated in your decision making. Every disaster that I've ever led, there's been contention, there's been disagreements. But when it comes time to make a decision, can we all get behind this decision? Can we all do what we need to do to support the decision and the implementation of the decision? If there's something that's really flashing red, or you think this decision is going to drive us off a cliff, we need to have that conversation. But ultimately, getting everybody on the same page is job number one. And using these principles and thinking of it in terms of, I guess, telling a compelling narrative. And that narrative is protecting your community and getting your community to a place where the incident has been stabilized and people are safe. That's the focus. And you can't do that if you're not engaging and including your partners and setting everybody up that's at that proverbial table to be successful. I mentioned earlier when we were talking the EOC, and it's looking at an EOC, an emergency operations center, and you got 30 agencies represented and 45 people and a policy group and logistics and everything else. And it's like a lot of people don't know if collaboration is happening. I hope it is. Keep our fingers crossed. But how much of what we do is performative, or to tick a box, or because, planning guidance says that we need to have these people in the room, so they're in the room. And it's maybe not the right people from those organizations, but at least we can say, hey, someone from that department was here. That's a cultural shift to not just within emergency management, but for those agencies and organizations that have a role to play. Emergency management is kind of everybody's job. I especially when I was a local emergency manager, I had an opportunity, and it was one of my favorite things to do new employee orientation. And I would get like 30 minutes to speak to new employee orientation and talk a little bit about like disaster preparedness and everything, because it was a city that, is prone to disasters and stuff, and wanted folks to feel like our workforce was prepared and that they knew some basics about how to take care of themselves and their families, because if they can't take care of themselves and their families, they're certainly not going to be able to take care of the city during an emergency. And I would always ask, who here does not have a role to play some way, shape, or form in emergency management? And like hands would go up. I'm like, where do you work? Oh, I work in sanitation. Great. Who do you think is going to be taking care of debris issues when we have a flood that comes through town, or a tornado, or a wildfire? It's going to be the sanitation department. I did get stumped one time when it was someone who worked for the Arts Commission. And she's like, yeah, Arts Commission, don't think I have a role. And I was like, great opportunity for me to think about improvisation and what role you could have. I was like, well, public information, communication. You've got artistic sensibilities, being able to display data and share information and communicate. You could be helpful in that sense. That might have been a stretch, but generally speaking, everybody that I've ever worked with in the government sector in particular, we could find a reason they needed to be part of that emergency management enterprise. And it's incumbent upon the emergency manager to figure out ways to engage those folks and to make it worth their while. Oh gosh, we've all sat in meetings where you walk out of that meeting and it's like, not only could this meeting have been an email, but did I need to be in this meeting? What did we just solve by spending 2 hours together admiring this problem. You've got to be able to find ways to justify people's presence in meetings. Otherwise, they are going to send their third string, fourth string, fifth string person who's not going to be a decision maker, not going to be able to inform the process in a way that you need to do inform it.
That's a good point. And I think the opposite is true as well. Sometimes when it comes to certain meetings, you might have, or certain responses, I would say, sometimes you don't get the A players. Sometimes you get the B or C players because the A players decide, I'm going to the command post, or I'm going to another part of the response, especially if it's a complex, broad type of situation. And so having those people at least knowing and being able to play that role is important. I know you touched a little bit upon this at the start where you talked about improv, some of the improv methods. How can organizations support their staff in developing collaborative instincts rather than just procedural compliance?
Yeah, it starts at the top of the organization and modeling that kind of behavior, making sure that leadership knows how to engage in that way and is intentional and thoughtful about engaging in that way. I've been in organizations, and as a leader, I've probably been guilty of it too, of like being a little dismissive of some partners. Oh, that agency, that director over there, they don't take this seriously. It comes down to your ability as a leader to be really thoughtful about how you're engaging and to model that. Your team, your partners, they see it, they sense it, they know when there's tension, they know when you're not being authentic in how you're engaging, and it can hurt the organization. The other piece is clear expectations, getting clear about what the goal is, what we're all driving towards. There are times where it does feel like it's a checkbox, and maybe sometimes it is. It's like, look, I know nobody wants to be here. I bought coffee and donuts to try to entice you to come, but this is something that we have to do. We have to get through it if we're going to qualify for this particular grant funding. In those circumstances, if we can still find a way to add value to what it is we're trying to accomplish, is it the Eisenhower quote, something about, plans are nothing, but planning is everything? It's an opportunity to engage and get to know people. I've never been part of a disaster, I don't think, where I've like pulled out my emergency operations plan and be like, all right, first we do this, and then we do that. It's like, that has to be already just muscle memory at this point. You have to be so familiar with what it is you're going to do. And everybody that's part of the response or the recovery mission or whatever it is you're working on has to be so familiar with it that it's just second nature. And you do that again by building that culture of inclusion and collaboration and the recognition that we can't do what we're expected to do on our own. And we shouldn't be. Emergency managers don't have They don't own everything. They don't own all the snow plows. They don't own all the fire trucks. They don't own all the people in the jurisdiction, the government staff to do all the things. And it's been very rare in my experience where I've had to like play that card of like, look, we've got a disaster declaration. The declaration says I'm allocating resources for this jurisdiction. I'm taking your people and moving them over here to do this thing, or I'm taking this resource and going to move over there. You get much better results when folks feel like they're part of the decision-making process and they're empowered to make those decisions. So to build that culture of collaboration on the blue sky days pays huge dividends on those dark sky days. And then being able to articulate the value of what everybody just did. Hey, I know that was really tough and it was a 18-month slog to develop this new natural hazard mitigation plan, and it wasn't a lot of fun, but because we went through and did this, now we all have a much better relationship. We have a better understanding of who our teams are, what the hazards are. We keyed in on this, part of our community that's vulnerable to landslides that none of us had visibility on. Now we know about that. And oh, by the way, we just had a disaster declaration, and because of that, we now are eligible for $3 million in FEMA funding for disaster mitigation. So being able to justify and articulate the value proposition of participating in the process by being part of the team, by engaging, that's a piece that I think we sometimes miss.
Mm-hmm.
Disaster's over, everybody leaves the OC, and we don't always do a good job of celebrating what we accomplished. And it's hard in emergency management. Sometimes what we accomplish is nothing happening. And you don't have a parade when that place that used to flood now doesn't flood because of that floodplain restoration project we did 4 years ago. It's not on the news. But boy, if we hadn't done that restoration project and 60 people had to leave their homes and 20 homes were destroyed, that'd be on the news. And it wouldn't be a positive news story. So being able to find ways to articulate and celebrate and recognize what we've accomplished by being part of this collaborative enterprise in emergency management and the broader emergency management system becomes important. But it goes a long way towards justifying the time and treasure that we spend trying to get some of this stuff done.
I want to focus a little bit on stakeholder management and expectations. How do you balance conflicting stakeholder needs while still moving the project forward? I'm sure you've had incidents where you have folks who are pretty high level individuals and, they've driven that stake into the ground on different parts and can't meet together.
Yeah, competing priorities become a big deal, a lack of clarity on what those expectations are. And sometimes it's just maybe personality issues. Boy, that person was mean to me, and no, we don't have a positive relationship. You can't overstate the importance of communication. It was true when I was on the public side, and it's super true now on the private sector side when you're working with governments across the country, and they've brought you or they brought me on as a consultant to help solve a problem. Being able to really understand what it is we're trying to solve. I know that I have used consultants in the past where I'm like, yeah, I got this kind of thing that's not working too well. I just need you to fix it. Okay, that's not necessarily great guidance. What about it isn't working? What does the end state look to you in a perfect world? And trying to map that a little bit and establish those milestones or benchmarks and maintaining a level of communication so that if you need to course correct it becomes huge. I said earlier, not everybody sees themselves as having a role to play in the emergency management system. It's a little bit different during response. I think when something bad is happening, everybody rolls up their sleeves for the most part and jumps in and wants to be part of the solution. It's those blue sky days when you're working up towards what a response is going to look like. It's doing those exercises and getting people engaged in training or a plan review or an after action review after you've had a bad day. Certainly the recovery slog of months or oftentimes years or many years to get through a recovery process, it becomes more challenging and more challenging to engage folks. So articulating what those milestones are, making sure that you've got sort of a project management plan where you've got regular check-ins, you've got deliverables, you've got accountability, you've got quality control and quality assurance. You're able to be flexible as someone who's managing this process and understanding that there are going to be things that pop up that need a course correction, things that maybe weren't anticipated. And if you don't have that flexibility baked into your process and become too rigid, I don't know that you're going to do too well and build the bridges and the friends and the networks you need to be successful in this work.
So this is one of my final questions. As we know, with fixed price contracts or limited engagements, how do you manage the scope of engagement to prevent what we would call scope creep and the resulting, impacts to budget and schedule and things like that?
Yeah, I love to get all the good ideas out of the way up front. When we're as a private firm proposing on submitting a proposal for a RFP or request proposal or something, I a lot of times try to think about what else could we be thinking about or should we be looking at that maybe wasn't part of the scope of the RFP. We did a project for a multi-county jurisdiction for their alert and warning framework. And they wanted translations, they wanted templates for messages, they wanted procedures and protocols and all these things. And some of the things that we saw as valuable to that process that weren't included in the scope were engaging with the surrounding counties. If you've ever hit the send button on a wireless emergency alert or something through iPause, boy, that's a stressful moment. But you also know that it's not just going to hit your jurisdiction. You better be giving a heads up to those 911 centers and the agencies around you and maybe even around them, so they know what's happening. So that when their 911 center gets a call saying, "Why did I get this message?" they at least have visibility on what was going on. So we recommended an engagement strategy with those neighboring counties that weren't necessarily part of the planning process, but just that they would have visibility on what was being built, what those protocols were going to look like, what the triggers were going to be for certain types of alerts, what the messages might say, given these 20 scenarios that we mapped out and did templates for. So that was one thing that hadn't been considered, but was something that's going to be very, very valuable for the end product, for a more comprehensive understanding of what was being built for that multi-county region. And then another piece was doing a workshop for elected officials in that multi-county area. When a bad day happens and an alert goes out, or maybe more importantly, an alert doesn't go out, or a bad alert goes out, they're not necessarily going to call the emergency manager or that 911 center director who hit the send on the message. They're calling the county commissioner. They're calling the mayor's office. They're calling their elected officials, demanding accountability, demanding answers. So let's do a half-day workshop with all elected officials from this area. Let them know, again, what we're building. This is the process. These are the expectations. When we're having a bad day, this is what you can communicate to your people, your constituents, so that they know that that there's a process, there's a system for getting information out and what they can expect in terms of follow-up messages, how to sign up for opt-in alerts, the differences between a wheel alert and something you might get from, an opt-in email lister, those types of things. So those are things that we brought up on the front end of the conversation. But if they had emerged during the project process, it would have been like, ooh, yeah, that's kind of outside the scope of what we've been talking about. And to build that out now, 6 months in, halfway through the project, it's going to extend the timeline, and it's going to extend probably the cost and be a hit to the budget. So there are things like that you can do on the front end to mitigate that a little bit. The frequent check-ins. I'm going to use myself as a bad example of this, bringing on a consultant, bring on a contractor to write a plan and giving horrible direction about what the expectation is of what I want the plan to incorporate. And then getting 2/3 of the way through the process before I have a check-in with folks doing the work and saying, oh, that's not really what I was thinking. That's not what I was looking for. If you can manage the process that you've got those continual check-ins, and again, this is whether you're working with a private consulting company or one of your staff who's working on a project. We're not mind readers here. We need to make sure that we're communicating what it is we're building. If there's something that's popped up that's delaying the project, something that's going to change the financial impact of what you thought the estimate was going to be, having those clear lines of communication, those set milestones, and figuring out what your communication cadence needs to be with the right people so that nobody's surprised. We all get surprised every day by things that happen, and none of us like those surprises that shouldn't be surprises. And then the final piece to bring it back to the improv stuff is getting to yes. When someone makes a request, whether it's a request of a consultant or contractor doing work, or one of your team members or a partner agency or something like that, saying no is like hitting the easy button. If I say no to this, I don't have to do anything else about it. I can forget it, and it's gone. If you're a parent and the kid says, hey, can we go do something? Can we do this? Can I do this? Can I have this? Nope. Great. Conversation's over. Don't need to worry about it. When you say yes, you've committed to something. You've committed to following up on something, to be accountable for something, to doing something, to putting action towards something, or putting a resource towards something. And so being in that mindset, and maybe that's part of the culture shift too, shifting the culture to a get to yes culture, it commits you to doing things. So whenever we can find a way to get to yes, and that's something that I've always told the folks that I've worked with, that's like standing order number 3. Standing order number 1 is take care of our community. Standing order number 2 is take care of our partners and each other. And standing order number 3 is getting to yes. If we can find ways to get to yes, that doesn't just mean, oh, you wanted to add something that's going to triple the timeline and quadruple the dollar amount, and we don't really have the budget for it. Yeah, sure, we'll still do that anyway. That's not what that means. It means, yes, we can do that. Here is how we can do that. And these are the decisions that you're going to have to make about committing additional resources, about extending the time for us to be able to do that. So it's that back and forth, and it's that getting clear again on those expectations, and being communicative and overly communicative at times. Just everybody has so much going on. There's never just one thing happening. It's incumbent upon all of us to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to ensure that we're not just communicating and giving information, but that information is being given the right way, it's received and it's acknowledged, and we're course correcting as needed.
I want to thank you, Andrew, very much for sharing your experience and your principles, guidance on improv theater and how it's applied to engaging stakeholders in the emergency management and public safety work that we do. Andrew Phelps is the Chief Operating Officer with AC Disaster Consulting, with more than 2 decades in emergency management and operational leadership. He shared with us how we can apply improvisational theater techniques and methods to engaging stakeholders in planning and in actually responding to emergencies. Andrew, I want to thank you very much again for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Andrew.
In a world where emergencies are becoming increasingly complex and varied, the need for effective coordination and planning has never been more paramount. Enter the Project Management for Emergency Managers workshop. This unique online learning experience is designed to equip you with the tools and strategies to streamline your emergency management efforts. Over the course of 6 engaging weekend sessions, we delve deep into the principles of project management, tailored specifically for your needs as an emergency manager. Learn the skills needed to navigate the complexities of emergency management.
You've been listening to Riding the Wave, hosted by Andrew Boyarsky, President of Pinnacle Performance Management and Clinical Associate Professor in Emergency and Project Management at NYU and John Jay College.